My name is Ozi Alosium. I am currently the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Administrator for the Denver Public Library System, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I am so honored to have both Chichi and Satoya here with us today. I'm going to very briefly read their bios, and then we'll turn into conversation. I've got some sort of pre-written questions for them, and then we'll open it up to the audience to ask questions as well. So without further ado, I will share the intros. So today we have Chichi Agorom, who is a writer, a certified Enneagram teacher and practitioner through the narrative tradition. She's adjunct faculty at the Narrative Enneagram and a former psychotherapist whose life's work is to support people on their journeys towards wholeness and healing. Her greatest joy is learning how to belong to herself and creating spaces, both physically and with her words, that help others feel less alone and more known. She earned a Master of Arts in Clinical Mental Health Counseling and Postmaster Certificate in Marriage and Family Therapy. She also holds a coaching certificate from the Enneagram in Business. She lives in Los Angeles, cultivating a life of rest and peace by the water. We also have Satoya Foster. Satoya Foster is an artist, trauma recovery advocate, and a program director at the Narrative Enneagram. She earned a Master of Ministry from Richmond Graduate School in the Mission School of Ministry cohort and is currently working towards a doctorate in ministry at McCormick Theological Seminary. Satoya is a lifelong learner that enjoys reading, jiu-jitsu, and nurturing ease in her life. She resides in Tennessee with her high school sweetheart, their daughter, and their four-legged canine son. And you can connect with Satoya via her website, and I'll also put Chichi's Enneagram page on Instagram in the chat as well, so that you can follow that. Where is my chat? But it is such a pleasure to have you both with us today. Thank you for being a part of this conversation. We are recording for folks who are not here, so that they can access this as well, because we don't want anyone to miss out on this richness. Are you two ready to hop into the questions?
Yes, thank you for those introductions, Ozi. I'm very excited about this conversation.
You are so welcome, me too. Okay, so I don't know if you know this, but Chichi came out with a book. She wrote a whole book. It's behind her. It's also in my hand. It is available to order today. We'll put it in the chat. Some Black-owned and BIPOC-centering book distributor, so you can get your copy as well. If you stay towards the end of the conversation, you can also learn how you can get a free copy of the book through DPL as well. But I want to get into the questions. In her book, Chichi gives an overview of the Enneagram as a whole and the 9 types of armor that she writes about in the book. My question for you two is, what is your armor and how do you stay armored?
So I'll go first. My armor has to do with the story that I have to be seen as exceptional in order to have access to love or acceptance or approval. So I have to offer something that stands out. I have to offer something that is different from what other people offer in order to feel like I am earning my access to acceptance and approval. And I think I was thinking about, I know this question will come up later, but I was thinking about that in the context of just this process of writing a book, which is very public and visible, and thinking about how one of the stories of my armor is that if you see me as intelligent, cool, creative, whatever it is, my story is that I now have to work hard to maintain that image of how you see me, because that then determines whether I have access. How you see me determines if I am approved of or loved. And so that makes it harder for me to access ease and rest in my own body and in my own self, because I'm working so hard to maintain an image for you to continue to approve of or accept or love. So for me, that's one of the components of how I stay armored, or what my armor is.
That's so interesting, because there are like similarities between how you and I both armor, but in different ways. So for me, it's like I work really hard, I do a whole lot, but it's because I need to be able to maintain my strength. I need to be able to maintain my sense of autonomy, my sense of will, and that like no one can make decisions for me. I make them for myself. I reference myself. um, and so another aspect of that comes up for me is this idea that I don't want to be affected by things outside of me. So that's a big part of how my armor plays out.
How do you keep yourself from being affected?
um, a big part of it is denying that I am affected. So even though I know that softer piece exists underneath,
Mm-hmm.
we don't look at that. You know what I'm saying? Like that part gets ignored, um and toughening my exterior is what I do in order to kind of like almost like power up a little bit to make a separation between how I think someone is actually affecting me versus what I want to control.
Mm.
Yes. And for those of you who have not, I mean, I don't know that many of you would have read it because it just came out today, but if you were lucky like me, you got a free copy. But in it, Chichi defines armor in such, I think, a profound and beautiful way. She talks about how pain is inevitable, right? And it shows up in our formative years. And so we sort of develop these patterns that we adopt to help us avoid pain. And that is the armor that we think is our whole and our fullest selves. And that's part of what is so brilliant about this book is the language that we're granted to understand that we are carrying armor, because some of us might not recognize it. Armor can manifest in ways that are, they grant us access in society, they're applauded in society, right? And so it's easy to miss how that's actually minimizing our potential to show up as our full whole selves. And so this idea of not only being able to see and name the armor that we carry, but also to be more conscious, right? And how we're showing up in our fullness. And again, I could talk a lot about how beautiful this book is and how amazing and grateful I am for it, but I want to move us to the next question. Chichi talks also about how the Enneagram offers us to make space between not only ourself and our armor, between who we are, who we really are, and our survival strategies. My question, sort of to build onto this conversation around armor, is who are you without your armor? What practices help you remember and return to your fullest, softest self?
Yeah, there was something you said in that last piece that I wanted to go back to, which is that often our armor can be applauded by society, right? Which makes it so much harder to begin to create that space between your fullest, truest self and your armor. If there's anyone in here who is not familiar with the Enneagram, I will say that just as a general, explanation of what this is and the context for this conversation, the Enneagram is a system of, is a human development system that shows us 9 distinct types or archetypes of personality that we use to navigate the world. And these personality types are kind of like our survival strategies that we use to protect ourselves from pain or from difficulty or suffering. And they are necessary. And the invitation of the Enneagram is for us to recognize that we are not just our personalities or our survival strategies, that there is a full whole self that is distinct from this strategy that we've used, or these strategies that we've used to navigate the world. And I think that it's so important to highlight that because often in conversations around the Enneagram, we talk about it like I am my type, like I am my personality, I am my survival strategy. And I think that that does us a disservice in the pursuit of wholeness and liberation and ease, because if I believe that I am my type, I spend all of my time in this one singular story that doesn't allow me to experience the fullness of what else is possible. And that's the invitation that I hope that the book offers to people. But to your question about who we are without the armor. I think a practice that helps me reconnect with that, has helped me reconnect with that, is to really pay attention to my body, and to pay attention to what it feels like when that story of I have to create an image, I have to figure out how to get you to see me in a good light, in a positive light for who I am and what I do. What does that feel like in my body? For me, it is, I'm a heart type. So a lot of the energy of my story is held in this like upper chest area. I feel it gets tight and constricted when I'm in that story. I feel unable to access a sense of groundedness and calm, which usually I feel like in my lower belly or my legs, because all of my energy is up here trying to get you to see me a certain way. I feel stuck in my head usually when I'm in my story, running through the different scenarios of how you might be perceiving this conversation, how you might be perceiving how I'm showing up, or trying to construct a narrative that I can then play out to help me get more acceptance and love. So for me, it's been really helpful to notice when my body is in that space versus when I feel more connected to my fuller self. I might be in the same sort of distressing situation, but when I'm connected to something other than just my singular story that I have to be exceptional to be loved, I have more access to like rest and ease in my body. I feel calmer. This doesn't feel as tight. I feel access to the other parts of my body that I forget when I'm trapped here. And I'm able to respond from a place that feels congruent with what I know is true versus the one story. There was something else I was going to say about that, but I'm gonna, Satoya, I'll let you speak for who you are without your armor on.
This is such a tough question. I think I'm still very much living into the answer of that. I I kind of want to like name part of what I bring into the room. So like I'm Black, I'm a woman. I also have a history of developmental trauma, which also shows up in how I move through the world and how I understand the world and myself and others. And so cultivating ease is something that I've been kind of really trying to live into this year, because with my pattern, my thing is to basically do the most, and I have no idea that everything else has gone off screen. So like I'm not the kind of person that anyone has to be like, oh, you need to work harder, because trust me, like I'm probably gonna outwork any expectation anyway. But like I've been trying to lean into the softness by trying to cultivate more ease in my life. And the point to which I noticed that that was important for me was I was watching a friend of mine cook, and there was no haste, there was no rush, there was no like she wasn't thinking on to the next thing. Like she wasn't following a recipe. She was like really smelling all of the seasonings and things that she was using, and she was like, you know, I'm just gonna add a little white wine to this, and just so I'm just watching her just easily cook, and I'm like, oh, I'm learning something here, you know. And this idea of like slowing down and not constantly moving and doing and allowing myself to be still, allowing myself to do things with ease and not rushing through it. Um, so that's a big part of what I'm working to live into at this moment. So I'm still, as one of my mentors would say, I'm still kind of letting the unfolding occur with regard to that. And I think part of the answer is living it. So that way it becomes a part of the practice. So that way it's something that I can integrate into how I want to experience my life and how I want to experience all of the things that I'm doing without the unchecked haste.
I love that so much, Satoya. And I feel like there is, like, one of the things I talk about in the book is the importance of slowing down, right? This is the one of the basic or common themes within the narrative Enneagram. It's like being able to pause, to notice and to pause. And I loved your like unchecked haste. Just as a reminder too, that like our types operate in rapid fire speed. And so without that conscious practice of pausing to slow down, we're on autopilot, but we think that we're the ones in control, especially for people whose part of their armor is around control. It's like easy to believe that you're the one in the driver's seat, meanwhile, your type is the one running the show, and you don't actually have access to your full self until you start to practice slowing down. And I was thinking too, as you were sharing that often Black women mistype as the type that, can we say, can I say 8?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So Toya identifies as a type 8. And often Black women mistype as 8s because to some degree, that is part of the armor that we're required to carry in this culture. So even at the beginning, when you're like, I'm not the kind of person who needs to be told I need to work more, like I can outwork you. There is this story that I have to be strong, I have to be capable, I have to be able to endure anything without breaking, without falling apart. I can't let myself be too affected by what's going on around me because I have to keep moving forward. And so that armor in itself is so familiar to a lot of people who hold, to Black women and to a lot of people who hold marginalized identities, because in some ways it is required by the outside world, which then makes it harder to create that space because you still see the need for it in many spaces. So it makes it harder to create that space to distinguish between, no, this is me. I have a tender part to myself. I have needs. I might also enjoy slowness and stillness, even though in many spaces I do feel like I have to show up prepared for the threats of the world.
I love that. And I have a follow-up question. I have 2 follow-up questions. I didn't, not pre-written. In your book, Chichi, you talk about sort of the type that the US sort of embodies or models. Can you speak more about what that type is and what that means for us as we also navigate our own personal types?
Yes. So the US often is referred to as a type 3 culture. Type 3s are the performers on the Enneagram. And the story is that you have to be seen as successful or capable in order to be approved of, have value, be accepted and loved. And so regardless of what your primary type is, if you're raised in this culture or have spent extensive time here, there's a layer, the cultures that we're in inform the way that we see the world and inform the armor that we carry, even though we might like to think that we are separate from, we are informed by the cultures around us. And so all of us to some degree here have that layer of 3-ness where you have to produce, you have to show yourself as capable, you have to be seen as successful to have any sort of value. And I think that then the invitation for the 3 is the invitation for us all, which is to recognize that our value is not attached to what we do or what we earn or what we produce. That is part of what helps free a 3, is the realization that I don't actually have to work to prove to earn acceptance and love, right? That those things, if those things are inherent, then I am free to approach my work and my career and my life from a place of desire, maybe from a place of joy, as opposed to a place of, I need to do this to prove that I'm successful, to prove that I'm enough. And within the story of the 3, there's really never enough. Like you have to keep doing, right? You have to, there's no point you get to where it's like, okay, I've done enough. I finally meet the goal. I can rest. There's this constant motion that's in place, which makes it very hard for them to access stillness and rest. So that's one of the layers of armor that we carry within the society, separate from our individual armor.
I wanted to say, in addition to that, I come from a background where, like, I'm a first generation Jamaican American, and even in what you're saying, Chichi, I'm identifying some of that success piece where it's like, your family comes to this country, they come to America, they've made this huge sacrifice and all of that stuff. So it's like, you better produce, you know what I'm saying? Like, you better be successful. Don't waste my plane money that I took to come over here. Like, go beat the books. Like, that was very much the mantra in my house. Like, go to school to make friend, go read. So it was all about like this, like, be successful.
Yes.
And I identify some of that in some of the immigrant culture as well.
Yes, that's also so very true for me. Yes. And I think that, well, we could explore that even more, but absolutely, I definitely relate to that.
I got another follow-up question that I wasn't we're just gonna go with the flow. Also, I am also a daughter of Nigerian immigrants, and that was very much instilled in me. It was during the pandemic, I was talking to my mom, I was like, you should go to therapy. And she's like, I work, that's how I relieve my stress. And I was like, I don't know about that. But what I really also appreciate about the book is that you use it, or you invite folks to use the Enneagram as a way to better understand our parents, and to also create some of the forgiveness that I think is necessary for us to have the adult relationships that we need to have with our parents. So can you speak more, both of you, to how the Enneagram can be a tool to help repair or to deepen relationships, especially with our families?
Yeah, for me, working with the Enneagram offers me access to more compassion for people, and that includes my family. Because the example I gave in the book is that when we're children, we see our parents as kind of the architects of our entire experience, right? If I had a good childhood or a bad childhood or whatever in between, it is because these adults who were in charge of my experience did or did not do X, Y, Z. And then the older we get, the more mindful we become. We realize that our parents are whole entire people, separate from just your mom or your dad, right? They have their own experiences of trauma. They have their own experiences of heartache and stress and joy, and that had nothing to do with me. And so I think in many ways, the Enneagram allows for us to create a little bit of distance, right? Rather than see my mother's survival strategy as something that was directly targeting me, it helps me to see it as that was how she navigated. That's how she knew how to navigate the world. And in 9 different ways with the Enneagram, we realize that none of us are perfect. We just have our individual stories of how we think the world is. And I feel like the older I've gotten, the more I've realized, like, parents are just humans trying to figure it out. Like, they don't actually know everything, even though you think they do as a child. So I think that offers compassion as well. But to the point of using the Enneagram in that way, it's really been helpful. My mother identifies with the type 1 structure, and growing up with 1, there was a lot of expectation on me to be good, to always do the right thing. But of course, being good and right was defined by my mother's definition of goodness and rightness. And that was a lot of our friction growing up into early adulthood as well. But understanding the Enneagram and seeing her through the lens of the Enneagram has given me so much compassion. So when she shows up with that armor, what I am thinking is she's terrified of being bad. She's terrified of her daughter, whom she loves, being bad. That's where this criticism or this, desire for me to be good or do the right thing comes from, and not because I am inherently unworthy or bad, right? It allows me to create that separation that then doesn't demonize her for her survival strategy, if that makes sense.
For me, I don't have a relationship with my father. When it comes to my mom, she hasn't taken the Enneagram. Like she hasn't done a lot of the Enneagram work or anything like that. But in my heart, I kind of hold her as possibly leading with a 6. So she would be very concerned about safety and security and surety and things like that. And so the Enneagram has really helped me to humanize her and not and kind of look at her in a more expansive way as like a person. I think also becoming a mother has done that as well. But my standpoint is like a big part of my role is protecting her, and so if I'm protecting her and she's looking at me for safety and security, that kind of interaction was not necessarily the healthiest. But now that I'm older, I've been engaging, doing Enneagram work and different things like that. It's allowed me to, as Chichi was saying, create that distance. So I'm not over identifying with my mother anymore. I'm not over identifying with her needs, or over identifying with my understood role as the protector within our dynamic. But now I can say, okay, these are where I need to place some healthy boundaries. These are what I need. I can imagine this is probably what she needs. How can I best support her within what I understand her needs to be, without kind of doing the thing I would typically do in the past, like just kind of take over and do everything for her. Like, there was a point in my life where things weren't going so. I'd moved out of my parents' house. Things weren't going so well with them, and my decision was like, oh, simple. I'm just gonna move her out of the house when she's at work. So when she was at work, I just packed up all of her things and called her and was like, hey, just so you know, you don't live there anymore because I decided that you need to move. So, you know, and I still kind of think it was the right decision. But now that I've done a lot more work, I'm like, I need to allow people to make these choices for themselves. So with regard to like these familial relationships, it really helped to create that distance. So that way I can make healthier decisions for myself, but not assume everyone else's stuff and taking on everyone's stuff as the strong one. So that's a big part of how it plays out for me.
So much resonance in that. I could go into talking about my mom, but I won't. I'll move on to my next question. Also in the book, Chichi, you talk about healing and growth as not only individualistic, right, but being collective work. And I would love for you both to talk more about how community or Black sisterhood helps nurture and protect your soft self. And I'd also like you to define, I think intellectually we know like what softness is, but like how does softness show up in your lives?
It's a great question. To the first part of the question, I think that often conversations about wellness or healing are very individual and very internal. Like I write about in the book, it's like me working towards being my best self, me wanting to learn about the Enneagram so that I can learn how to be a better version of whatever type I am. And the invitation that I am offering with this book is for us to consider that this work is communal and not just individual, that beginning to name our own patterns and understand the way our armor works for us is the first step, and it's very important. But then it's also really important to consider how the way that I wield my armor to protect myself can also cause someone harm. And what does that look like to consider that part of my responsibility also, rather than to say, well, that person needs to figure out how to show up differently, right? Or that person needs to figure out their own stuff. To realize that if we really say that our freedom is interconnected, that requires these processes to also include communal work. And so to that point, I feel like one of the ways, there are more ways, but I'll just say this as my first answer, one of the ways that I think community supports this is, one, I think in each person doing their individual work, right, of building awareness around like my armor, my triggers, that sort of thing, but also being able to hold space for each other's soft selves. This goes back to armor being applauded in society, where often I think in relationships, we can get used to the version of a person that they most frequently show up as, even if it's not the truest or fullest version of them. So when they start showing up or attempt to show up in their more true, authentic self, there might be pushback because it's like, no, I like this other version where you take care of me all the time, or I like this other version where you make all the decisions, or whatever it is, right? And the pushback is on like, no, go back into the armor. That works for me. So I think communally being able to expand our capacity to hold space for more expansive versions of each other, as opposed to the singular story, requires me to ask, how do I benefit from this person's singular story? Like, how do I benefit from, if I'm in relationship with somebody who believes they have to take care of me all the time? How do I benefit from that? And how do I subconsciously or consciously hold them to that story when they might want something else, right? When they might need me to show up to take care of them, for example, or whatever the scenario is, as a way to practice being in community in this sort of healing work. And then your last question around softness, I think, should I answer that now, or did you have something to add to that part, Satoya? I felt like I said a lot of words.
Oh, yeah, whatever works for you is fine for me.
I think softness for me is the ability to be fully present as exactly who I am without the fear that makes me put my armor up, right? Allowing myself to be vulnerable, allowing myself to be seen exactly as I am, not just through the lens of the image that I've created. Allowing myself to, softness for me also is experiencing joy. I think this is Brene Brown who says, the experience of joy is one of the most vulnerable experiences actually for us as humans, because we want to be armored up. We want to be prepared for, like, this is probably not going to last, or when's the next terrible thing going to happen, or, and so being soft also includes allowing myself to cultivate a practice of joy and allow myself to actually experience joy in my body, not as an intellectual exercise. Allowing myself to be the recipient of care and tenderness, rather than feeling like I always have to be strong. I always have to have it together and be in control and keep moving forward. So those are some things that come to mind for me.
So my memory is not as good as Chichi's, so I remember the second question and I don't remember the first.
The first question was around the importance of community and individual healing, and how community and Black sisterhood helps nurture and protect your soft self.
So that's such a good question. When I think of community, I think of, I'm probably not even going to say this correctly, but like, it's this concept, I believe it's called like Ubuntu or something like that, where it's like, I am because we are, and we are because I am, and that interconnectedness that we all have, which, even though I cognitively understand that, it doesn't always translate in how I feel, because that interconnectedness, the recognition of that, means that I also have to recognize that I can be affected by other, not just that I can be, but I actually am affected by other people. So much so that I didn't even want to say that. You know what I'm saying? But just
because people are messy, and it's hard to, it's like, that requires me having to trust you. but are you
Yes.
trustworthy? I don't know, so.
Yes, I think about like something as simple as driving. Like I have to believe that you care at least about yourself in your car on the road, that you will not like veer into my lane and my car with my partner and my child in the car. You know what I'm saying? So we are connected. We affect each other. Like even if I don't always care to admit that, it's just what it is, and I think that if we there was a quote that I read the other day that talked about it was talking about self-awareness, and it talked about self-identification as a means of empowerment. And like if we can all become self-aware, we can all learn how to define ourselves and give people the space to also define themselves, then we can, I think, better work together. We can better support one another. We can better hold space, as Chichi was saying. We can better bear witness to each other and each other's stories, because we're believing one another, we're hearing one another, and not trying to alter the other person. So I think that that's one way that we can work collectively in community with regards to that. When it comes to the question about softness, can you ask the question again? Because I don't remember the whole thing.
Yeah, just what is softness for you? How does softness show up in your life, or how do you define it for yourself?
Yeah. So the way I define softness, so it took me a bit to figure out the softness piece, because vulnerability is difficult for me, because that means that I have to admit certain things. Like I have to admit that someone affected me, or I have to admit that, like, oh shoot, like all of the shoulds that I'm doing, or all of the things that I felt like I should have done, then having to like work with that internally or whatever. But I'm fairly good at being transparent, and I'm not always the best at being vulnerable. I can tell you very detailed things about things that would be like real difficult for another person to hear, but for me, like, it's no thing. I've already worked through that, so I can share that very easily. But for me, softness is talking about something I'm feeling as I'm feeling it, that doesn't relate to anger or frustration. It's very easy for me to be like, first of all, this is whatever. I feel frustrated with da 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 da. But for me to say that something made me feel sad, or something made me feel like disappointed, um, or something or someone hurt my feelings, or like having to talk about those particular things, especially if I haven't dealt with it myself first and other people are accessing that, is kind of feels like a little too much for me. But I'm working on that. I think that's another one of those things that I have to continuously interact with and allow the feelings to come up, and not try to replace it with something easier, like being stoic, or try to like harden myself, or try to mask it with like anger or frustration, and be able to say, man, that really hurt me. So yeah.
I resonate so much with that. I'm like, especially the part about being able to just be in the experience that you're having, instead of just reaching for anger or frustration as it's just really vulnerable. And I think this is where, I don't know if this is just me, or if this is a shared characteristic of our types, but I do that as well, because it's much easier to control the narrative of how I share it and how the other person maybe might hear it if I wait until I've processed, rather than be honest and vulnerable in the moment. And so I won't talk about how I'm feeling hurt or sad or upset until I've had time to sit with it myself, and I've figured out how I can communicate that in the way that best suits the story I want with the other person. Yeah.
Some of that too, though, like even as you're saying that, I'm thinking about my difficulty with asking for help.
Mm.
And like, that's very much interwoven in that for me as well. Because even if I were to share, like, this is something that I'm feeling right now, that person may want to help me. And if they help me, I feel like I have to figure out how to rebalance things and help them back.
Ah.
And then sometimes I also don't recognize that I actually need help. But when it's a moment where it's like, oh my gosh, this person is offering something to me, like I feel both tender and really uncomfortable because like, and I think some of the immigrant story kind of comes into this for me, where it's like, you don't take things from people. If you can't get it yourself, you don't, like that whole thing. But accepting help and having to figure out like, okay, how do I recalibrate this to where I don't feel
Like you owe them something.
yeah, like it has to be reciprocal for me to maintain my power.
Mm. Right. Which is a perfect example, right, of how when we stay in that, if that's the only story that's true, how then do you have access to being cared for without
Right.
like you need to give something back?
Right. Which is really secretly what I want, actually. Because I had a friend once that asked me a question about the essence of her question was, how can I protect you? And I was like, I feel so seen. I don't even, I've never asked, I didn't ask for this, but she saw something that I needed so clearly in the moment that I never ask for, that I never talk about.
Yeah.
When you said about that about transparency versus vulnerability, that really resonates. I think sometimes we think that transparency is just saying the hard thing versus like being in that hard experience and letting someone else also be in that experience with you, because it is not familiar, right? It is really, really scary. And yeah, I'm gonna be sitting with that definition or that distinction a lot. I have another sort of follow-up question, and this is also part of why we wanted to bring Chichi and you to Satoya to this conversation. We, as a library system, are really prioritizing how we're advancing racial equity and also racial healing, and also trying to provide our community, whether that is our internal or our external community or both, with tools and resources to help heal, to help respond to the harm that comes from existing in systems of oppression, but also the harm that comes from sort of fighting against systems of oppression. I'm wondering if you could talk about the importance of leveraging tools like the Enneagram and situating it in the Black community or situating it in communities of color so that those folks have access to resources that I think have historically been whitewashed.
You'll go first.
Sure. That's another really great question. I think the Enneagram is really helpful with regard to helping people identify, because the Enneagram, in a way, it's like people can learn how to identify bias through the Enneagram. And I feel like that's a great starting point to help us kind of start to engage some of that work. So I think that, and I think the other thing I think with you talking about it being whitewashed, that has historically, at least in this country, been very true. And I think that when we utilize the Enneagram within different communities and different cultures, it helps to expand the language that we use. So when we talk about like the different types, we talk about the subtypes and different things like that. What ends up happening is that a particular experience gets centered, and oftentimes within the culture that we're in right now, it's centered on whiteness. And so how can we expand it to where people can see themselves within the Enneagram? Chichi had mentioned earlier that oftentimes Black women get typed as an 8, but it's like, what am I bringing to the table, or what is each person bringing to the table with regard to their bias as to why they believe people are typed a particular way, or why this person would be that type, or why that person would be this subtype. And so I think the more communities that have access to doing Enneagram work, it will help to enrich Enneagram work. It will help to expand the language. It will help to include everyone at the center, as opposed to it being centered on a dominant white experience.
Yes, all that Satoya said. And I would say, in addition, when I work individually, like one-on-one with people, one of the questions I ask often, and I ask this question of myself often, is what else is true? Because our types create a singular story of who we have to be okay. So when you think about that in terms of like collectives or cultures, we talked about the US, we talked about immigrant culture. I think of US Black culture as a type 7 culture, probably with a very strong 8 wing. Actually, I think both a little bit of 6 and 8, right? We need to kind of threat forecast and plan for the things that could go wrong, and we need to have this sort of don't mess with me energy, and to protect what's ours. But I think primarily what I notice is the need for humor and lightness and optimism to make pain and suffering more bearable, right? Important, because also the pain and the suffering is not going away. It's inflicted on a regular basis. But what else is true, right? Like, how can we have access to, or build our capacity to be able to sit with grief as a teacher? Because we know that it doesn't actually, if we ignore our grief, if we ignore our pain, it doesn't go away. It's stored in our bodies. It comes out sideways. We carry it with us. In addition to the armor we're already carrying, we're carrying all our unprocessed grief, all our unprocessed trauma, all of these things, right? So I think of that too as part of the necessary work in this regard, is as we are able to name, oh, this is what I always do. I turn to the memes and the music and the turn up and the humor as a way to cope. That is absolutely fine. And what else is going on? Can I make space for the full spectrum of my experience rather than holding to this singular story of what it means to be okay? Because maybe we will be okay on a base level, but that's not thriving. We're still just surviving, right? So I think that the use of the Enneagram in Black communities, in communities of people who hold marginalized identities, can help us to expand beyond just what helps us survive. Being able to cope using optimism and humor helps us survive, absolutely. But what supports our thriving? It's not just optimism, right?
Beautiful. Wow. Yes, yes. I'm gonna have to rewatch this myself. Chichi, you talk about how showing up as we show up as our full selves, we invite others to do the same. Can you two speak more to the ripple effect of embodying freedom?
Yeah, I think of how watching somebody else, we tend to replicate what we see. I know that these are somebody else's words, and I don't remember who said this, but it's hard to be something that you can't see, that you don't first see, right? Which is why we tend to stay stuck in patterns. If you only see this certain kind of thing in your family, you tend to replicate that until there is this understanding of, oh, something else is possible, right? And so I think that the more that we work towards embodying freedom, it allows the people around us to go, oh, there's a possibility for something else. There is, and that is, Toni Morrison says, like, the function of freedom is to free someone else, right? It's this ever expanding. If I'm watching Satoya give herself permission to slow down and to soften, and she's not doing that for me, actually. She's doing that as a way to support her own growth, but that might give me permission to go, oh yeah, where in my life do I need to slow down today, to soften? I have it's the automatic communal permission to step into something more than I might have considered if I was just if I wasn't surrounded by these examples of freedom. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think that for me to practice ease, it also allows other people, or at least for me to allow other people in the same sense. Not necessarily that people need my permission, but like I feel that I can almost better make a separation on my expectation of others and giving them the space to thrive as well. Because if I'm not paying attention, um, like if I'm in a place where I'm constantly doing, how am I not expecting that of others? If I'm in a place where I'm not doing my inner work and I'm not um, being kind or practicing softness, how can I um, have that same interaction with other people? So I think that I think Chichi is spot on there. I'm really still kind of processing what you're saying. It was really, really helpful.
And I feel like some of what I'm hearing from what you're saying is like how we project our own internal stories, right? Onto, if I'm not doing my work, then how do I expect others? But I also think about how if I'm not building that self-awareness within myself, then I'm projecting my story onto the people around me. So for this makes my mother sad every time she tells me of this or reminds me of this. But for the longest time, I didn't really like myself. But because I didn't like myself, I projected that onto everybody else and just assumed that nobody liked me, right? In the work I have done to come home to myself, to learn to love, yes, to love myself, but beyond that, to like myself, it's easier for me to believe that people like me when they tell me, right? But prior to doing that, I would have just assumed or placed this, placed the responsibility for my own happiness or my own well-being on this story I'm projecting onto the group to say, I feel this way because you don't show up for me in this way. Meanwhile, it's my internal story that's being projected onto the group. So the more I free myself from that story, the more I can interact with other people in reality, as opposed to through the filter of my story.
Yeah, that's so good. And I also end up feeling a freedom to not um overtake other people's freedoms within their story, and like, you know, trusting that they will either know what's best for themselves or they'll figure it out.
Yes, and as you're talking, it just reminds me, like I mean, I've been on a journey to find rest and ease and softness for like several years now, but I think within the last year and a half, it's been more accessible because I've more intentionally surrounded myself with people who are embodying it, and it's reset like what I normalize, right? So now my closest circle, rest is just like at the core. I am actually acting unnormally within this context by not prioritizing it. And it's more of a reminder to me to move beyond intellectualizing like my commitment to these things, but actually embodying them. And so I think part of this is like, if we are modeling it and if we're seeking people who model it, it becomes easier for us to access it and to choose it for ourselves as well. And I think that's profoundly important. It's something to think about as we're thinking about the people that we are in community with. I think that we can trauma bond, we can grief bond, but like, what does it look like to bond over joy and softness and ease and play? And how does that expand what we believe is possible for ourselves, but also for our communities?
Yes.
Chichi, you make several nods to important Black women authors like Zora Neale Hurston, which is my queen, as well as Toni Morrison, Tricia Hersey, and some other folks. You also point to, or you also name the Enneagram lineage that you stem from. Can you both speak to the importance of lineage in liberation work?
Yeah. Two thoughts with this. One is that lineage helps remind me that this work has been in motion for a long time. And that's especially helpful for me when I'm just like nobody's changing. These systems are not going to change. What's the point? Like, I want out. But the courage of these people that came before me who had less proof than I do today that things can shift, that their courage to keep creating and speaking into existence this world in which we are all free, I think is important to name. And then with the Enneagram lineage, when I was preparing to write the book, I was reading this book called Where on Earth Did the Enneagram Come From? And it was the first time that I really recognized that so much of the history of this system as we use it today originated in communities of color. And like Satoya mentioned at the beginning, it was so whitewashed in the United States. And just even that recognition of this came from traditions in communities and countries today that we would still here consider other. But this is where the wisdom originated from, gave me a sense of, I don't know if permission is the right word, or maybe confidence, using that same I was saying with lineage just now, but a confidence to add my voice to this conversation. Because while technically my book is the first Enneagram book written by a Black person for Black people, my voice is not the first in the actual lineage of where these wisdom traditions stem from. I think that's important to note, because we often default to the centered culture, and y'all don't own it. And that felt really nice to name.
I honestly don't have much to add to this question, because I just felt like Chichi, I feel like she just answered it so well that like my wisdom right now is knowing that she really held that question well. So we can move on to the next one.
Thanks, Satoya.
I have a couple questions for Chichi specifically about the book, and then I'll open it up to the audience for the last half hour to ask questions or to respond to how this conversation has been resonating with them. Chichi, again, congratulations on writing this book. As you said, the first technical book, right, written by a Black person using the Enneagram for Black people, which I think is a huge, huge thing to note. What was it like writing this book, and how did your armor get in the way of you writing it?
Well, I started writing the book in 2020, which, if we all remember, for some of us might feel like yesterday, but technically it's been 2 years, was a crazy time. And I had 6 months to write it. My contract was for 6 months. One of the things that I didn't expect, historically, my relationship with creativity is based on like inspiration, when I feel inspired, when the muses are musing. And it was very hard to feel inspired at the start of the pandemic. And there was so much going on where I'm like, really what I want to do is just curl up in bed under the covers and not deal with this stressful world. And this book actually offered me a sense of consistency that felt really grounding in the midst of the chaos. I had, because I knew I had to get it done in 6 months, it was on my calendar. I wrote 3 days a week for 2 hours at a time. And it was like, no matter what else is happening, I'm gonna just sit in front of my desk. Sometimes I wrote alone, sometimes I wrote with a friend, but I'm gonna take that with me from this process, the reminder that actually I can use consistency as a supportive tool with creativity, as opposed to just waiting for inspiration to strike, which is also counterintuitive to my singular story. But otherwise, writing the book, I think, and your question about how my armor showed up in the process, at the start of it, because of the work I had been doing and still continue to do to create space between myself and the armor, I was aware that my story, my armor would kick in with are you the right person to write this book? Are you good enough to do this? Are you qualified enough to do this? Will they have a conversation with you and decide, well, seemed fun on paper, but like this is not the right person for the project. So I had made it like my practice actually before the conversations about the book. At the start of that year, I was like, I'm just going to say yes to things without like jumping to the 5 steps in the future to figure out whether or not it'll work out well, whether it'll be too vulnerable. And I think that really helped this book exist, because there were so many things I said yes to that if I had let my story kick in, it would be, and my story did kick in. It was like, what are you doing? Are you prepared to do this? But still just moving forward regardless. And then I think that one part of my armor is that it is not really failure that scares me, like whether this book does well or not. I'm proud of the fact that it exists regardless. Success is what scares me more. And so the armored story was, what if this goes well? What if I become more visible than I am? I'm generally a private person. I love being a private person. I can't tell you the anxiety it gave me to take my social media account from private, which it's been for so long, to public because of this book. I am 2 seconds away from making it private again, but I would try to stay accessible. But it was that fear, because as I mentioned at the beginning, right, part of my story is, if you see me as this thing that is good, right, I now believe I have to work extra hard to keep up that image, right? So that was one of the difficult parts in navigating my armor as I was writing this, and especially in the last few months of getting ready to launch it into the world. And I try to remind myself regularly that people can have whatever visual view image of me, but it does not mean there is space between the image and me. And trying to be present with me, honestly, is really just trying to connect with my little self, who is losing her mind that she actually wrote a book like she said she would when she was 10. So like being with that version of myself, as opposed to what I think is expected of, an author or whatever it is out there in the world. And not allowing myself to become over-identified with the image out there. It's also been difficult, I think, armor-wise, to navigate being, I don't even know the right way to phrase that. I pull back when I know that something is expected of me. I just don't give anything at all then. And so I feel like I've noticed myself get quieter as things are ramping up with the book, because I'm like, I just don't want to deal with anyone's expectations. So I'm gonna just get private again. So I noticed that as part of my armoring process as well, where other people might be more like, let me share everything about my life. I'm like, no, I'm gonna just observe y'all doing what you do, the book. Yeah.
I love that. That fear of success, right? It's like, what if you get everything that you want, right? I think too, I'm reading The Salt Eaters right now, and the first page, it's like, are you sure you want to be well? And I'm like, that's such a big question. And for the longest time, I was like, am I? But yes.
Because it requires you to let go of something, right? It requires you to let go of the story, my story, that I need to earn wellness. I need to earn acceptance. I need to earn love. But if I really want it, that means I have to let go of that story. But that story has kept me safe for over 3 decades. So yeah.
And for me, it's like, it's the story that like, I will always not be well, right? If that's my baseline, then I'm never going to pursue it, because I don't believe that it's possible for me, right? And so it's like, if that's a single story that I'm telling myself, that I need to fight against all odds to persevere, to demonstrate that it's possible, or whatever the story is, I will never then believe that I can get there. And so that's something that I have definitely been trying to internalize since reading your book. The sort of the last 2 questions I have before I open it to the audience are, how does it feel now that you've finished the book, now that it's officially out there in the world? What is your greatest hope for the book now that it's out there?
Feels good to be done. I finished writing it last year, so today more so feels like the conclusion or of the the ramping up process to pre-orders. And that feels good. I feel proud that I, set out to do a thing and did it. I feel grateful for the support of the people who helped me, and, provided a safe container for me as I embarked on this process. And my hope for what it does in the world is twofold. One, we've talked about like the access to more expansive stories. And I really hope that Black folks feel seen in a way that they don't usually in this particular narrative that doesn't center us or center our experiences. And I hope that it begins to open. My book is just a launching point. There's so much more to be said on this. And so I hope that it opens the door to more conversations around creating space between the fullness of who we are and our survival strategies. And I hope it encourages people to pay attention more to these practices that help us to come home to who we really are, even though the world continues to still be crazy every day.
Yes, and speaking of that, I'm going to go ahead and put in the chat now. So I am putting in a survey link, and it's going to ask you if you would be willing to participate in a book discussion, because we wanted to introduce you to the Enneagram. We wanted two practitioners, specifically two practitioners of color, right? Two practitioners who identify as folks with identities that have been marginalized in our broader community. We wanted them to lead this conversation, but we also want you to engage in dialogue and to have access to the book as well. And so if you are interested in participating in a book discussion that will take place tentatively at the end of next month, potentially beginning of May, feel free to sign up in the chat. As part of your participation in the group, you'll get a copy of the book, either via audiobook or physical copy, because we want to be accessible. But we also know that, yes, you can probably check it out, although there might be a hold at the library, that this is one of the books, at least for me, that you're going to want to underline, you're going to want to come back to, you're going to want to have it as a tool in your toolkit, and to want to make that available for you all as well. So if you sign up via there, you can go ahead and continue having conversation about this book after you've been able to spend some time with it. But I will now turn it over to you all to ask questions. If you've got a question for the next 15 or so minutes, go ahead and raise your hand or pop it in the chat and we can get into it. And I'll also put in the chat links to buy the book if you want to buy it on your own or send it to a friend. I've definitely been sending them to friends. These are all Black-owned bookstores. One is local. Matter is local, but I know that they're back ordered because we bought the books.
While we wait for questions, I'd like to say that if there are people who are on this call who are Black women, I am hoping to launch in the next month a cohort for only 12 at a time, but a space where we can actually practice together what it looks like to explore what our armor is, who we are without the armor, and also the difficult emotions that can arise when we start practicing for the first time, lowering the armor, because there can be a lot that comes up with that. And just because you're doing that work to learn to create space between armor and you doesn't mean that your friends right now or your family right now are a great place to practice. So having like a supportive container in which we can practice what that looks like together, practice naming the armor, practice creating space between self and the armor together for 12 weeks. We'll hopefully be launching soon. So if you're interested in being a part of that, it is not live yet, but I'm just telling the people who joined these calls this week. So you can email me at hello@chichiagorom.com. I'll put it in chat and let me know that you want to be a part of it. And I'll make sure that you get the information before it goes live to everyone else.
Incredible. I did not know you were doing that. Wow.
I wasn't sure I was going to because there's so much going on, but it feels like this is actually what I want to do with this is create and hold spaces for these kinds of interactions. So
Yes. Okay, questions. I know that, or you can also just share your reflections on this conversation and how it landed in your body, what messages you're walking away with. I did see some comments in the chat about Satoya's description of an 8 being really, really resonant with someone being grateful for the language of a singular story, and the question of what else is true, as well as your description, Chichi, of projecting, not liking yourself, and how that might feel existing in a predominantly white space. Actually, can you two both speak more to that about what it, and that's, I think, one of the beauties of the book in terms of being a tool for folks who have identities that are marginalized, to navigate being or existing in these spaces. Can you speak more to how folks might navigate their armor or feel able to release their armor when they're existing in predominantly white spaces?
I think for me, my experience of this was that it was very hard for me to differentiate between my armor and myself when I was in predominantly white spaces, which was a lot of my life in the United States up until recently, because I was rewarded for my armor, right? It never felt good, but I didn't know how to separate, and I didn't feel safe to bring the rest of me to the table, because it felt like what was expected of me was to show up as this armored version of myself in order to be okay, in order to be accepted. And so navigating it for me was really difficult, to the point of the person who mentioned that. It was very difficult while still surrounded in that space. And that's why I think that the community piece is really helpful, to have spaces in which you have it feels safe enough to reconnect with, wait, but what else is true? If I don't have to be this way with you or in this circle, I get to remember that I'm more than just this way that I have to show up in this other space. And for me, part of my healing was leaving. So I know that not everyone can leave, and but part of my healing was to say, I need space to explore the fullness of who I am without constantly being in the white gaze.
That everything you just said is 100% factual. Like, I've spent a lot of time in predominantly white spaces. I've worked in predominantly white spaces for a very, very long time. And I got to the point where I was just tired of code switching. I didn't want to do it anymore. And I made a promise to myself that, like, I'm not doing it anymore. And a big part of it is I didn't realize the bits and pieces of myself that was just kind of crumbling, and like the ways that I would siphon off bits of myself because of like the white gaze and the expectations, and in a lot of respects being the first Black friend for some white folks, um, or being one of a handful of white people, Black people in a white staff. So I was tired of the code switching. I was tired of having to make my voice sound higher so that way it sounds less threatening. And I was tired of like not wearing my door knocker earrings because they look too aggressive. Or I was tired, like I was just tired of it. Like it's much too much. And I'm not like a circus animal. I'm not like anyone's like, oh, can you do this thing and tell this story the way you told it? And it's just like these requirements of me when I just want to, just be myself. So I 100% feel what you just shared, Chichi, like in the depths of my soul.
Same. The whole the voice thing, the pitch, was a revelation to me when I moved here to the US as a teenager, where I would say this is probably the regular cadence of my voice. Like, even if I'm happy right now and I sound like this, but it was like that's like so aggressive unless I sound like this. And it's like, oh yeah, it's so nice to meet you. And I'm like, that's not how I sound. And it was like those things were the conscious, like, how do I come back? Even in those little things, how do I come back to myself and not take responsibility for you being uncomfortable? Because that's not my responsibility, you know?
Yes. And it's just like, listen, we about to be uncomfortable together then. Yes. Like, if I'm going to be uncomfortable, guess what? You are too.
I see that someone asked, how do you navigate vulnerability and shame? Being hurt while being vulnerable can reinforce our shame at times. How does the Enneagram help you navigate this? Great question. Pause for a second and think about how, unless you already have an answer for this, Satoya, I'm just going to pause.
I'm actually doing the same because this is a pretty deep question.
Mm-hmm. While you're pausing, I'll share really fast. Also, thank you for modeling, taking the time that you need to actually respond. I think we often feel that we have to respond immediately and not process and digest. So take your time. Bree put it in the chat, but I'll go ahead and put a link to Soul Sisters, which is an amazing Black femme-led nonprofit here in Colorado doing incredible work around Black wellness, Black well-being, specifically prioritizing the well-being and the health of Black women, as well as the joy. And so each month they do a self-love Saturday and invite people who identify as Black women to participate in a conversation, usually featuring a facilitator. And so in May, Chichi will be joining us, we'll be joining that group and doing a workshop that combines breath work as well as partner and conversation exercises to really take it further in terms of what she shared here today. And so I dropped the link to the website, but if you keep your eye out for more information as the weeks progress, as well as if you look at the follow-up email that we'll send, you can find out how to register for that as well. But just so you all know, another way to engage with Chichi's work.
Thanks for that, Ozzy. So thinking about vulnerability and shame and being hurt while being vulnerable, I feel like vulnerability, like the practice of vulnerability includes accepting that you will get hurt because we are all messy humans being messy together. So that's just kind of a given. But, shame the story of shame is that I am bad, that there's something wrong with me, which actually is linked to a lot of the different armors across the Enneagram. The one I'm thinking of most, or the two I'm thinking of most clearly right now, are the type 1, the perfectionist, and the type 4, the romantic. And there's like this strong sense of like, at my core, I am bad, right? So if somebody who identifies with either of those attempts vulnerability and maybe gets a response that feels painful, it can reinforce, if you're not practicing conscious, awareness of it, it can reinforce that story that says, see, well, my story is true, that I am bad, or I'm not enough, or whatever it is. So I think what I want to say about this is that this is where part of the work of creating that space and that distance is helpful, because what I believe is true is that inherently at our core, we are worthy, we are enough. We don't have to earn goodness. We make bad decisions, we make mistakes, we do things that are harmful to others, but that is not coming from like just a massive core of badness, right? Whereas shame says, I am bad. Being vulnerable and experiencing hurt allows me, if I create space, it allows me to say, that sucked. That was not how I was hoping that would go. I wish that they had held space for this differently. I wish they'd responded differently. And how can I offer some of that to myself in this moment, instead of going into well, I'm bad. I asked for too much, or I'm not enough, and that's why they didn't respond in this way, or I should have been able to figure it out on my own. Can I give myself some of the tending I wish that they had offered me? And, Brene Brown talks a lot about, shame work, right? I think a lot of it is just being able to catch the thoughts of shame as they come. In my work with individuals, sometimes I use the analogy of the baggage claim area in an airport, where you're standing waiting for your luggage and you're watching all these bags go by, but you're really only there to pick up what's yours. So you can watch the thoughts, you can watch the story of shame as it comes in that says you're not enough or you're bad, but you don't have to pick it up and take it home like it's yours. You can just release it and tend to, I'm still proud of you for showing up vulnerably and saying what you needed, even though they didn't respond the way that you wanted them to. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that was a good question, and such a helpful response, Chichi. So in type 8 fashion, I was told my entire life I was too much, too loud, too opinionated, too much. And so when I first engaged the Enneagram and wanted to be intentional about, like, what does this vulnerability thing look like? What does it feel like? And then eventually I was like, oh, it feels like when I share and then I tell myself I can never talk to that person ever again. That's how I know that I've been vulnerable. But a big part of that, like, kind of exploration for me was like leaning into excess. Like I went from like not telling anybody anything to excessively telling everybody everything. And like to the point of like, someone at church would be like, how are you doing? And I'm like, I'm menstruating, how are you? Like I would just I would just be like bleeding all over the place. And so it took me a while to kind of realize that I don't have to be vulnerable with everyone, and everyone doesn't deserve that. Everyone may not honor that. And really trying to be present with myself in the moment to know whether I built enough trust in that relationship to share vulnerably, and then do whatever needs to be done after the fact for whatever vulnerability hangover may exist after sharing.
Yes, that part. Not everybody deserves our vulnerability, or not everybody has proven that they are capable of holding our vulnerable selves, which I think goes back to your point too with transparency and vulnerability, right? Like it's easy to, and I feel this true for my type structure as well, where it's easy for me to talk about things in ways that people think I'm being vulnerable with, and I'm not, right? But the actual like vulnerable parts of me, you have to prove that you are grounded enough in your own self to be able to hold space. Otherwise, I'm not going to bring it. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. And the thought that I could be vulnerable with someone and they take that and betray me with it is very problematic. So it's much easier for me to be transparent because I know that since I've worked with this, I don't care what they do with it anymore.
Yes. This is where, to the point of culture, right? I see Nigerian culture as 8 culture. So there's always been so much about the 8-ness that resonates with me, even though that's not my primary home base, because I'm like, yes, absolutely. All of that. Like I feel that to be true for me too. Yeah.
I love that. And I love the idea of thinking about it goes back to like individual and collective, right? Like collectively, what are we embodying and what types are we seeing? And I think that's a really important reflection. Just some other comments that came through: appreciation for speaking of how this manifests in our body and how that's important for healing, as well as appreciation for using the Enneagram to examine how we interact with our parents or our caretakers. Someone said, how do we figure out what Enneagram we are? Any recommendations for folks?
I think reading, we encourage in the narrative Enneagram to like the process of self-observation. I know that there are tests out there. My tiny little what's it called again? Soapbox is that it can take away from the experience of really observing yourself to just put it into a test and it says you are a 6. It's like, what does that actually resonate with you? Can you see the patterns play out over your life? So I would encourage you to read about it. And then within the narrative as well, we do typing interviews. So it's like 45 minutes to an hour where you sit with a practitioner and we ask you questions about your life. Like some of my questions are, what does success mean to you? Or what's your relationship with anger like? Or how do you make decisions? Those sorts of things. And we'll be listening for common threads of core motivation throughout. So that's an option. I think the narrative also has a test on their website. Satoya can tell me if I'm wrong, but I think so. That's like a series of 9 paragraphs that you can read and kind of process through, rank your top 3, and then spend time exploring those 3. I think the best way is self-observation and self-exploration.
I just posted Chichi's website, and I'll repost Satoya's so that you all have access to that. But yeah, I did my typing test I read about it before, so I had some of an idea walking into it, but then I did a typing test with Chichi and it was wonderful. It was so helpful. I'm a 4 and it makes sense. When you said that about good and bad, yeah, that all resonated. But thank you all for attending this session. Thank you, Satoya. Thank you, Chichi, for your words and your work. And just your wisdom and energy. This has been such a beautiful conversation, and I will for sure be rewatching it. And I hope that other folks rewatch it as well. We'll send out a follow-up email that includes the book link, as well as the recording and the survey if you do want to join us for our book discussion. Take care, everyone.
For holding all this space, Ozzy. It was wonderful. And thank you, Satoya, for your presence and your wisdom.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah.
Congratulations on the book.
Yeah, congratulations.
Out everywhere today. If you read it and want to read or write a review, this week would be a great time to do that.